All right, first thing you wanna do, open Premiere Pro, obviously. Once you've opened Premiere Pro, you'll probably be hit with a screen that looks like this. Now, once you're in here, you can select a project that you've already opened if you already know how to do that. If you don't, you're gonna go up here to New Project, and that'll bring you to this page here. This is where you can preemptively select clips where you'll import to your project. It's up to you if you wanna do it here. This is one of the 3 easy ways to import your footage. There are always more than probably 3 ways, but I'm gonna show you the 3 easiest ways. If you don't import footage here, it's totally fine. I personally don't do that, but you're gonna wanna go up here and name your project, and we'll call it editing. And then you'll go ahead up here to the next spot where you're going to select where you wanna save the project. Once you've selected where you wanna save your project, you're going to hit create. So your project may look a little bit different depending on what screen you're in. Now in Premiere Pro, if you go to this little icon up here, there is a workspaces button. You can also get to this other ways, but this is the easiest way. These workspaces are predetermined workspaces that change the look of your layout, that you can actually alter yourself and save it, or just use it as is. They even have a little vertical one if you're editing vertical video, so that you have the most amount of real estate with your video so that you can edit it better. You can save workspaces, you can reset to default, you can edit them, etc. And they have a bunch of predetermined ones. You can even make some, like I've made a multicam one. And this is where you can go through and play with it to see what you like best. I personally go through the assembly, the editing, and then color usually are my 3 top ones, as well as vertical. And I have them all kind of altered to make my workflow work really well. We're gonna start here, and you're gonna notice you should at least be able to find your project up here. This is where you're going to have all of your files and everything for this specific project. If you don't see it, you can hit Window, and then you should find it under Projects, and it'll be right there. I also recommend having Media Browser up, and you can mess with whatever else you would like having show up in this screen. I also like my effects and my effects controls to be open, because those are very commonly used things. So real quick, we'll go over kind of what the important things are in Premiere Pro. We've got our project area, which is where our files will go. We've already discussed that. Effects is basically just a series of effects that you can pick from. Effects controls is how you control those effects or parameters of your video, such as zooming in, moving it, stuff like that. We'll get into that later. The other notable 2 things is your timeline, which is down here, which is where you'll be able to put clips in and edit them. And then your program, and there's also one called source. So program is where your actual video will show up that's in your timeline. Your source is what video will show up if you double click on one to view it before putting it in your timeline, and we'll get more into that later. But these are the most important screens you should have up in Premiere Pro. So the next step here is to start importing your footage. Now there are 3 main ways to import your footage that work the best. There's probably well over 3, but these are going to be the 3 easiest ways. The first way was to import your footage straight from, when you open the project. Now there is a little tab up here in the top left that I clicked on to get here, and this is a spot where you can also import your footage. You can even create a new sequence and import the footage into the sequence and all that, or create new bins, which is a new folder, and other stuff that you have the ability to do here. I don't normally import my footage from here. It's totally up to you if you like the look of it and how it's organized and such. But that's one way you can import your footage. The second way you can import your footage, which is my more preferred method over the import tab, just for preference, is going through Media Browser. I just find Media Browser to be a little bit easier to navigate through, but it is nice here how easy it is to scroll through some of these clips. But if we're in the Media Browser, so basically it's very similar as the import tab. It's just my personal preference because it's already within here, and you can even click and drag straight to your timeline, whereas from the import tab, you can't directly do that if you need to import different clips throughout a project. So the third way, and my favorite way, because it's the least complex way, is to straight up just go to your project files area, and then you're just going to grab a folder or multiple folders and import the footage. So this folder here has a bunch of social media clips from, making TikToks. If I just click and drag that entire folder into Premiere, it's there. everything's already there for you, and then even organizes it per folder. So if you have a folder within a folder within a folder, it'll organize it already just like that. And I think that makes life so much easier just to have all of that folder in there. Now, the one thing to note is if you do it this way, you may be importing more footage than you actually need for your project, which can eventually slow it down if you have a quite low-end computer you're using. But for the most part, you shouldn't notice too much of a difference. But the more that you do add to your project, the more buffer and the stuff it has to load each time you go into that folder, which can slow down editing a little bit depending on what you're using. I do this because it's the easiest way, and normally I'm not importing any additional footage than what I already need. So just keep that in mind. So now we have all of the clips we need to make what we need. You can also import audio and other types of file types and things like that. Quick note, you can also upload files from other programs through Adobe, such as Photoshop, Illustrator, and other places. And you can actually import the physical project file, and that'll allow you to change the original file and it'll update it within Premiere Pro. It's called Dynamic Link. It's a really cool way to utilize different projects and still be able to make changes to it and not have to re-import or re-edit your video and then export it. Quick tip for you guys. So the next step, now that we have our footage, is to create a timeline. There are two different ways to do this, and one of the ways I don't necessarily prefer. The other one makes your life much easier, but it is a more complicated step. The first way you can create a timeline is simply by taking your video clip or multiple clips at a time and just clicking and dragging over to this empty area, and it'll create a sequence. A sequence is technically your timeline. A sequence is created up of a resolution and a bunch of other settings to create your timeline. When you just straight up click and drag a video clip to the timeline area, just like I did, it automatically uses the settings from the video to create a timeline that matches exactly that video. So if you shot in a higher frame rate, like 60 frames per second, this will now be a 60 frames per second video sequence. That's one way to create a timeline. The other way is my preferred way, and that is to physically create a new timeline. So what I'll do is go back to my editing project, which will put the sequence in this folder here. You can do this in any folder you want. You'll click down to this thing here. It's a new item button. The new item button will then allow you to do multiple things, such as create, a black video, a colored background, black tones, adjustment layers, which is how we add effects and coloring, and then sequence. So sequence is what we want. We want to create a new timeline essentially, and we'll be prompted with this screen here. Now I have a custom made preset timeline already because I edit on a daily basis. However, you can pick a preset defined setting here. You could pick just the Ultra HD 4K, or whatever works for you. They even have social media ones. So personally, I usually just straight up go with a 4K timeline with the non-HDR, and I change settings from there as needed. And the way you would do this is by simply clicking this timeline. Say I wanted it to be slightly different or maybe vertical. I can click over to settings before I make it. And this is where you can change things. So I can change the FPS of the timeline. I like shooting in 24. You can also do 30. And then you can change the resolution. So if you are shooting vertically, you would just swap these two numbers around to be 2160 by 3840. And then you don't really need to mess with much other things that are already here. This is pretty well done already. I would just usually only mess with the frame rate and the resolution. You'll name your timeline to be whatever it needs to be, and you'll hit OK. And now you have a timeline that's perfectly curated for the video you want. The next thing is to actually start editing, which I'm gonna go over just quick basics of editing to make your life easier. So in my case, the timeline that I have is not curated towards the video that I have. And that, it's a mistake, it can happen. You can undo it and recreate another timeline. Or if you go ahead and just click and drag this onto here, it'll ask you if you wanna keep your existing timeline settings or change the sequence settings. Now, if I change the sequence settings, it will now match to be vertical, which is awesome, but it will also change the frame rate if the frame rate of the video differs from what you originally created in the timeline. That's important to note as well. But it is one way to switch the timeline around to fit your video parameters. But generally, I always push keep. Keep your timeline settings because you created them for a reason. You don't want them to change. If you do need to change your settings after you've already created a timeline, you can hit sequence up at the top here and go to sequence settings. And this is where you can change your resolution and all that other fun stuff. So what we're gonna do is just throw a bunch of clips in here just to show you guys some really easy and quick basic editing steps. And the first one is going to be cutting your footage. There are multiple ways to cut your footage, and this is going to speed your editing up by tenfold because you're gonna be using keyboard shortcuts. Now mine are different in some aspects as to what yours might be. So if you wanna check out what your keyboard shortcuts are, hit edit up top left, go to keyboard shortcuts, and you'll be able to see what they are. Now, the notable ones to mention are by preset, you have your Q and your W, which are going to be the same. Q and W are very important, which we'll get to. The other ones that I have physically changed, which you might change to whatever you want or keep it, is the selection tool. This changes so you can just use to select your clips, without making any edits. The next one is your razor tool. This is how you make just a single cut on a single, clip. And then my favorite one, add edit to all tracks. That is a big one because you hit a single button on your keyboard and it cuts every single clip, including audio and video, no matter how many there are in that spot, unless you have that area locked. And I'll mention that here in a second. So those are the main keyboard shortcuts you're gonna wanna know because they are very important. So the first one I wanna mention are the Q and the E. The Q keyboard shortcut essentially will delete every little bit of footage of just the clip you're on before where your playhead is at. So if you are scrolling through and you notice maybe you didn't start talking for a minute or you don't need this first little bit of footage, you'll scroll all the way up till you wanna start the clip and hit Q, and it'll delete every bit of footage behind that only for that one clip that you're on. Every other clip behind it will stay what it's at, but that one clip will get cut. Now W is the exact opposite. Wherever you find your clip you want it to end, you'll go to that and hit W, and it'll delete the entire rest of the clip in front of it, but it'll leave every other individual video clip untouched until you get to it. Now, the next key here is my selection tool, which is the same thing as this little arrow here. It just gives you the ability to grab and select clips and move them around, which is an important thing to have keybinds so you can easily access that to move clips around. And then the other one was your razor key, which is here. For me, it's V. It won't be by that for default for you. This just allows you to make a manual cut to one clip just because you may need to only cut one clip or something. All right, and then the last one was your make edit to all tracks. Now what this will do is no matter how many tracks you have stacked on top of each other, it will make a cut for every single bit in there. So you noticed even this little audio bit was cut, everything was cut. This allows you to get rid of a bunch of stuff at once or move a bunch of stuff if you need to. So if I didn't need the last half of this, I go ahead and just hit delete and delete that little bit, and I'm left with all these clips here. So that's an important tool to use as well. So the reason that the Q and W though are so important is because you can just simply play through your video, cut, keep going, find where you want to stop, and then cut it. And then you're just flying through your edits as you watch because you don't have to scroll through, find a spot. You're just hitting W as soon as you find the spot that you want it to cut, and you're just flying through your editing. Now, the other keys that I mentioned are helpful to make minor edits to certain places here and there, but your Q and W are going to be your best friends when you're editing because it's going to make you fly through a clip very fast. In terms of editing, that is the best way to get, if you're just learning, basic editing done. Just a couple things I wanted to mention about editing before we move on to export. When you're scrolling through, you may click on a clip that maybe you need to zoom in or move or something. You'll be met with this in your effects controls tab up here. This is where you can position your clip to be different. So if I wanted to move it left, right, or up, down, or you can hit this reset button to reset it. Or if I wanted to zoom in and then move it down so that it's in frame, things like that. You can also double click on your clip and move it around manually. That's totally fine too. Just keep in mind, if you do have two clips on top of each other, even if you click on the first clip and double click, it's always going to default click the top clip. So if you're trying to move an object and you're noticing it's not moving, it's probably because you're selecting the top clip, not the bottom clip. And then other than that, you can rotate stuff and fun stuff like that. These stopwatches up top here will allow you to make keyframes. So essentially what this does is you can click it, move forward a little bit, and then you can adjust parameters such as up, down, left, right, and then it'll slowly move it over in time. Basically, that's what a keyframe does, is it makes things change over time depending on what parameters you change. You can also do this with zoom, rotate, and a bunch of other stuff. That's on you to kind of learn and figure out for now, or watch some more videos. And then just below that, you have your audio, which is very similar. You can mess with the audio of your clip, whether it's making a keyframe of it going up and down and stuff like that over time. By default, the stopwatches are on for the audio. I don't know why, but you can just turn them off before you mess with the audio settings, or else it will automatically create a keyframe. And then lastly, over here on the timeline, just a few notable things. This lock button locks that whole layer, so you cannot do anything to it. Once it's locked, you can unlock it though. These eyeballs here basically just toggle on and off that track, so it'll make it show up or not show up. And then lastly, down here, there's mute and solo for audio. Mute will mute that track, solo plays only that track. So when it comes to editing in Premiere Pro, these are the absolute basics to know to get yourself started and get a video edited. It's probably the most important things to know on how to get started in editing in Premiere Pro without going too in depth on a bunch of stuff. Now, the last part about editing is exporting your footage, which is determinedly the hardest part for most people, but Adobe has made it really easy for you, so don't worry. So what we're gonna do is go up to the top and hit export, and it's going to bring you to a brand new screen where you can select a few things. First thing is, what do you want to export? The entire source, which is your entire timeline. It will stop when there's no more footage though. It's not gonna export the blank space afterwards, unless there's a clip way down in your timeline. You can select an in and out area, either by using these little buttons on the left and right here to select the spot you want it to go, or you can do it within your edit on your timeline by hitting I and O for in and out. That's totally up to you. But you can also do it here by selecting these two buttons. And there's also work area and custom. These are ones you probably aren't going to use as often unless you're doing this here, custom, which would be that. But now we've got our what we want exported selected. And you may notice for some reason it's not vertical anymore. Well, that's because my default preset from Adobe is high quality 1080p, which is regular horizontal. They do have some vertical presets that you could pick from, but it's up to you what you want to use. So my two favorite presets to pick from when you're exporting a video is one, this high quality 2160 4K preset. If you are doing vertical, you'll still notice that it's a horizontal export because you see these black bars. You can just go down to the video section and hit match source, and that'll match the resolution and everything of your source, including your frame rate. There's a bunch of other things down here that you can mess with. I normally wouldn't mess with them too much. But the other preset down here is going to be YouTube 2160 4K Ultra HD. And the reason I like this one is because it's meant for a social media platform. It is already curated for YouTube, which means it's probably pretty well curated already towards other social platforms. Which means you could probably also use it for TikTok, Instagram, and things like that without needing to know a bunch of knowledge and information about export settings, codecs, and bit rates and stuff for social media. So if you're not really familiar with video and stuff yet, just pick this preset and match the source. You can either export it, horizontally normally, or match the source if you're gonna be doing vertical stuff. Now, those are the two best presets, in my opinion, to export your footage, to utilize it best for social media and stuff. The first one I talked about is more for client work, if you're sending it to a client. The second one is more for if you're going to be posting it on social media. Now, once you're done with that, you can name it, and then you also can click this here to put a specific location of it. So if you want to put it in a specific folder, which I recommend, you'll click on that, select the folder, and then you can go ahead and hit export. The other option is to send it to Media Encoder, which will also export it, but it'll export it in a different program so you can continue to use Premiere while you're exporting your video. Now, if you have a lower end computer, it might be a little hard to export video and edit video at the same time in two different programs. Once you hit export, it'll export, and then you're done. That's the whole video, and that's how you edit in Premiere Pro with basics. Hopefully this helped you a little bit. Let me know if you have any questions in the comment section down below, and look forward to some shorts coming to all my social platforms once a day if you want to learn more every day. But I'll see you guys in the next one.